Okay, good afternoon. Welcome to this session for Mountain Connect on 5G and wireless opportunities and challenges. I'm Jeff Brown with Calix. I'm pleased to be joined by Mike Riley with Mid-States Consultants. Hi, Mike.
Afternoon.
We're going to talk a little bit about the various opportunities and challenges, specifically for utilities that are represented through some of the different technology deployments that are taking place and competitive moves around wireless. So first we're going to start off and I'll hand it over to Mike and he'll talk about some of the use cases that he's seeing in his everyday work with wireless.
You know, just to get into that topic, I mean, we've been involved with a number of different types of communities. And I think from our point of view, the ultimate has always been fiber to the home, fiber to the end user, fiber to whatever fixed device we're really, dealing with, just because it provides almost infinite bandwidth. But there certainly are those situations where wireless provides a tremendous tool for access and then for mobility. But we see wireless as being almost augmenting a fiber deployment. And a lot of the hype around 5G has really been focused on the idea that it's not truly a wireless network, but it's a wireless last mile, or really, in the case of the really high frequency 5G deployments, much less than a mile. Right. Wireless provides a tremendous tool, a tremendous additional, access tool in the playbook. So wireless gives us a great opportunity to get out to serve people that otherwise are just not cost effectively served, or really to start into an area and provide the better services. So to some degree, we'd love to see the customer being able to use the broadband connection and not necessarily know whether it's wireless or wireline. Although anytime they get up into really big bandwidth, obviously there's got to be a wire pretty close by, a fiber pretty close by. And that's actually where one of the places where Calix comes into play. They provide an awful lot of resources to support the deployment on any infrastructure and to support the end user experience. So with the wireless deployments, or fixed wireless local loop, whatever you want to call it, there's a couple different ways that we go about this. I mean, I think when people first said wireless long ago, the first thought was microwave backbone connections out to remote locations, remote copper deployments. And then they started thinking about cellular phones. And cellular has certainly done a fantastic job. We also think of wireless, for satellites, but satellites, I think everybody has seen, really do have a limited potential. I mean, even the 10,000 satellites being proposed, never really going to replace the other infrastructure, but just augment. So going into a new area, quite often we'll want to take a look. I mean, if we know this is really going to be a good area for fiber to the home, or direct fiber to some kind of big business entity, something like that, we want to just get in there and get all the permits in place, get the work done. But if it's an area that we're just looking to develop, certainly wireless is an option to provide service, to begin the market, to test the market, and then to augment what you can do with the fiber. Because even with fiber to every premise, there's no real mobility to that fiber. Although that said, once we have fiber to the home, fiber to the premise, Wi-Fi becomes the personal wireless network. And that can be a big play for any homeowner, even for any business. I mean, even here sitting at my desk, I've got an Ethernet connection wired to my laptop and also my phone. And also we have a Wi-Fi connection if I want to move around, do something else around the office, around the building, whatever, or connect my phone up to multiple of those access points. So back to the main story. as we get ready to really build on that fiber network, we're going to try and analyze that neighborhood. Obviously, we want to see, what are the demographics? What is our experience in a similar region? What do we see for that area? Who are the competitors? Although sometimes that's not as much of a consideration, because quite often the competitors are, building on an old infrastructure. But we look at a success-based approach where it's comparatively low cost and simple to come into an area or to extend out from an area into the next area, as it were. And
Edge out, yeah.
we can set up a small tower to get started with a wireless local loop access, but we need to feed that tower, and potentially we feed that tower with a wireless shot. But then again, the bandwidth of the total wireless connection, even with the biggest 5G projections, you're really kind of looking at a limited bandwidth as compared to what a fiber can bring. Then when you bring that fiber to that tower, you've got an interface between the fiber and the radio. And again, regardless of what your technology, 4G, 5G, whatever, that interface can be a big deal. So the cost to build in that interface, to serve that interface with power, and then to provide that bandwidth from the fiber into the wireless, there's a couple of considerations there of how you're going to deploy that equipment and power it and everything else. And Calix is really a good example of a company that can provide you with a small cabinet, a small enclosure with essentially a fiber interface for your bandwidth from the tower to the fiber, and also power up the tower to a small antenna. Yeah, I say small antenna, at least for those initial deployment locations. Right. So once we have a tower in an area, or kind of a hub location, then we can build out other hops of the radio. Although we really never want to go more than about 2 hops of the radio and then into the customer. It starts to cause too much latency, too much delay, too much concern for some kind of breakdown. When the customer calls and says, hey, I've got a problem with my service, most of the time it's a Wi-Fi issue. But if it's not Wi-Fi, it's a little tough to track those things down sometimes, unless you have some of the tools that actually the Calix and some others can provide for monitoring the service end to end. So when we look at some of these areas, wireless makes the most sense sometimes, where the fiber is just not going to give you a good return on investment. It has a poor ROI to really build a fiber into a really sparsely populated area. Although sometimes what you want, you want the same user interface, you want the same bandwidth experience, you want the same control of services, whether you're using the fiber or the wireless interface. But like on this slide that we actually show is actually an image from it's an image from Google Earth taken at an angle with the scale extremely exaggerated. And to just explain this image a little bit, the kind of rust red color is from what we call a heat map from a tower location that would actually be kind of, back behind where you're looking. The red areas are the areas that have a direct line of sight from the tower, because a wireless connection doesn't have to have a direct line of sight, but it's got to be fairly close to it. To really get the good throughput, you need pretty close to a direct line of sight, the Fresnel reflection areas, some of those kinds of considerations. And there are some beautiful tools to help you kind of modulate, monitor, model what you can do with the wireless, and even get some calculations of what kind of throughput you might get. Whereas with the fiber, unless there's a problem with the fiber, you just flat out get a solid connection and you can monitor that connection and look for problems. With the wireless, even if it says that you've got a good link, you're never entirely sure until you're really out there playing with it. And then weather can affect those kinds of things, really can be a big factor. In this slide that we have of the looking into this really rough area, sometimes you can hop in to one location and then shoot from there to pick up an awful lot of other locations. But ultimately, we want to come in with the fiber, and we might deploy almost the same kind of an ONT, an optical network unit, the customer premise equipment, to interface the wireless, and then bring the fiber in as the demand grows and the opportunity grows. But there are some really nice tools that we can use to really model an area, to get an idea of what's going on. And I included a couple of slides that are essentially a profile view of a path. Or sometimes you're looking at this area, you think it looks like a pretty good shot for wireless. Sometimes you have a pretty clean shot, and the software will tell you, hey, I can see that location. Other times there's a hill in the way, there's a lot of foliage in the way. We've got some good tools that will even really predict where that foliage might be a problem. And again, that foliage might be a problem 9 months of the year, or sometimes it's just totally blocks the path. Sometimes you can use multiple radio sites to cover an area that otherwise looks a little bit covered by the terrain, by the foliage, whatever. But the fiber really is still the ultimate solution to provide bandwidth to the home, and then deploy something like Wi-Fi 6 or whatever as kind of the personal wireless network there in the home. But then the thing I wanted to come back to, perhaps the most important tool that we use all these tools to get the network set up, to get the paths established. We can come back to those tools if there's a problem in the network. But once the service is up, the most important tools are the kinds of tools where you can monitor that service, you can monitor the throughput, the usage, the total amount of usage, both for monitoring the network, managing and monitoring the service experience. And then also you can look at those customers and say, I see these customers are using this much bandwidth. They might be ready for an upsell for another service level, or a way that we can improve their experience overall. And so those are the main points, the main ways that we use wireless, the main ways that we look to see, what fiber infrastructure do we have in place? What kind of fiber to the home do we have? What does a vendor like Calix provide to really give us those total package services? How can we then augment those services wirelessly or otherwise, with the assumption that we might come in later, build fiber to those same customers, and we really can relocate those wireless pieces of equipment to the next area that we're looking at. Over to you, Jeff.
And that makes a lot of sense, Mike. That's been a great discussion there. And so it sounds like what I'm hearing you say is fiber is ideal, but in a lot of situations, you just have to go with something like a wireless, and there's different ways to integrate it and kind of work with it. And there's some different challenges with it. That's why it's very important to get a consulting engineering firm like Midstate's involved to help you put together your design. I'm going to talk a little bit about the some of the different wireless deployments that are going on in the industry and what that means for utilities in terms of, do these represent opportunities or do they represent threats? So on this next slide, a little bit provocative here, but many of you've created business cases to deploy broadband, either with private funding or government funding or both. And a lot of those business cases have assumptions around the percentage of homes and businesses passed that will adopt your company's service. So you might be a little concerned now because there's a lot of news in the industry about some big name companies that are focusing on rural broadband. So let's talk about those and how you should respond. A couple of years ago, the thought was that the big mobile network operators would leverage 5G to offer a very high bandwidth fixed broadband service. And so far, we haven't really seen that materialize in a meaningful way, other than just a few handful of markets, larger markets. What we're seeing, though, is a very significant push by these mobile network operators to leverage their existing LTE networks. So recently, T-Mobile announced plans to offer 50 meg broadband to 450 towns and cities, and Verizon's offering 25 meg to 189 what they call lower tier markets. So bundling broadband and wireless will differentiate the MNOs, and they're fully capable of scaling this even more broadly as the 3G and 4G assets are already in place in most of the country. So, what does that mean? I guess the important takeaway from this is that these offerings, are 100% positioned to compete against legacy low-speed asymmetric broadband like DSL and HFC. Pay attention to the fact that it's 50 meg in one situation and 25 meg in the other, and their asymmetric offerings. That's the main takeaway on that one. So what about the satellite competitors? Mike, you talked a little bit about satellite and some of the challenges. We've heard some real big news about some big name companies intending to blanket the earth with broadband. And all three of these are in the LEO or low Earth orbit category. The first is OneWeb, backed by Bharti. They've coming out of bankruptcy. They've had some financial troubles, but they're intending to launch 650 satellites. Starlink, backed by Elon Musk's SpaceX, they intend to spend $10 billion and launch thousands of satellites with a 1 gig offering to the consumer. And then lastly, Amazon's Project Kuiper is spending $10 billion as well, and they plan to launch 3,236 satellites. I believe Starlink is announced over around 12,000 or so satellites. So a lot of different satellites going around. What does that mean for you in terms of offering a fixed wireline fiber broadband service should you be concerned? A recent McKinsey study said that in addition to being very expensive, right, you heard 10 billion for a couple of these, McKinsey says the development, manufacture, and launch of these type of projects are slow and take a long time to go from concept to reality. So they're intended to cover underserved areas of the world. If you think of some other continents where there's absolutely zero broadband, I think that's where the focus will be. Those of us who have been around in the industry long enough remember a company called Iridium. They had the same business model, so it's kind of come back around again. I think for utilities in this space, it's something to keep your eye on, but I think if you position yourself correctly, it's not something to worry about, certainly in the near term, and it shouldn't impact your business cases. So having said that, with all that, competition coming, how do you differentiate yourself and win in the marketplace? So, first, and Mike emphasized this, fiber's king. Fiber will always provide greater bandwidth, flexibility, and scalability versus other technologies. Operators should be doing whatever they can to justify building fiber. Many operators today are choosing to deploy 10 gig passive optical networks or 10 gig PON to cost effectively enable their network for long-term success. Second, if you're a utility looking to expand into the broadband business, remember to leverage your existing relationships with your customers. Some of these competitors we're talking about have no relationship with your customers, so unless they bought a Tesla. So capitalize on that by investing in initiatives that build on those relationships. Third, build your brand, not somebody else's. These other entrants want to come in, they want to push their brand in front of your customers, either directly or indirectly through a variety of offerings. Amazon, for example, they don't just own the satellites, but they also currently own the Alexa digital assistants and the Eero home Wi-Fi routers that sit in a lot of customers' homes. So utilities should be, thinking about the fact that you're going to have these type of competitors that are, going to have this go-to-market approach, and you want to build your brand, not your long-term competitors. So as you build out your network and organize your go-to-market approach, be mindful of using partners and vendors that will help you build your brand and your customer relationships versus get in the middle of those. So let's talk about some winning strategies to succeed in the environment. Table stakes obviously is high-speed symmetrical service. That's a big differentiator. If you're designing your network tied to government funding, I would encourage you, don't just think about meeting the mandated minimum speeds only, and that's it, because from a market competition perspective, in a few years, those will become obsolete, right? Because of the various competitors we just talked about coming from the fixed wireless side or the satellite side. So you want to focus on leveraging your fiber advantage to drive towards multi-gig offerings, maybe first for big bandwidth users in verticals like schools, healthcare, manufacturing, but then utilize data and analytics packages to understand your customers' demographics and usage characteristics. And then that'll allow you to market higher tier packages to those customers who fit the profiles. If you've enabled your access network appropriately to support 10 gig PON, then you have the flexibility to provide 1 gig and multi-gig broadband where it's needed, but at the same time, on the same ODN, you can offer GPON for lower tier subscribers. So you have quite a bit of flexibility there. Second differentiator or winning strategy is to provide managed Wi-Fi. Your customer's perception of their broadband service is directly tied to how well their Wi-Fi networks work. Mike said that, most of the trouble calls that come in are related to Wi-Fi. So even if you think you're not in the managed Wi-Fi space, you kind of really are, because you're going to get all those trouble calls. So the offering managed Wi-Fi, as a service in combination with a cloud-based analytics platform, that gives you great visibility into what's going on within the Wi-Fi network. It allows you to proactively prevent trouble calls. And then from a marketing perspective, it really arms your marketing team with great customer segmentation data that allow them to put together the right kind of packages to meet those appropriate needs of those specific customer sets. And then last, focus on customer service. Many utilities and co-ops are really successful in their markets because of their local approach to their customers, meaning they live in the same community as their customers and they run into the customers all the time. So that naturally fosters an environment and a culture focused on the customer experience. So let's talk a little bit about 5G. You see the slide here. The important thing is that there are different flavors. I guess I'll loosely say flavors of 5G. You hear a lot about mid-band and CBRS. They're in the lower portion of the frequency band below 6 gigahertz. And with that, the important takeaway at a basic level is that you see improvements over LTE with similar range. But at the very high end, you have mmWave, which offers huge speed improvements over LTE. But the downside is significantly more limited range. So to cover a market, you need to essentially blanket it with a huge number of small cells. So you hear this referred to in the industry a lot as cell densification. The MNOs leverage the spectrum across the frequency band to fill out 5G. So MNOs don't exclusively pick one or the other. Some lean more towards one or the other, but all of the various portions of the frequency band are required to kind of fill out markets and give more or less ubiquitous coverage. So in terms of use cases, generally speaking, enhanced mobile broadband is more or less outdoors and leverages millimeter wave. And a lot of the ultra low latency applications that are coming, like edge compute, augmented reality, things that require really low latency, are developed over here. And a lot of what you'd call the IoT applications, often referred to as machine-to-machine or telemetry, utilize the lower portion of the frequency band. Sensor detection for agriculture applications would be one example of that. So cell densification equals opportunities for utilities, right? So from the network operator standpoint, if you're a utility or co-op, you should absolutely be looking at 5G build outs as an opportunity to grow revenue. So when those mobile network operators come and deploy 5G in your markets where your fiber footprint is, you should be looking at that as a revenue opportunity. In the 3G, 4G build outs, the cell backhaul business relied on dark fiber and point-to-point or CPRI connections. It was a pretty straightforward business. With 5G, it's a lot more nuanced, with some of the opportunities that are going to come from private networks where for example, maybe a manufacturing location or some enterprise location has deployed a private wireless type network, and they're going to need a fiber connection. So that's one example of that that's fairly new compared to the legacy 3G, 4G environment. And additionally, because 5G overall requires so many more small cells with fiber transport, there's a lot of work being done in the industry to leverage 10 gig PON for mid-haul fiber transport. So there are different opportunities emerging in the space, different technologies that you can leverage to be able to take advantage of it. So on CBRS, right, a lot of talk about that. There's obviously a lot of investment that's going in here in the US, predominantly by the bigger players. You can see the top 20 listed here in terms of amount spent. If you are a utility broadband provider, what does that mean to you? Is CBRS going to be a threat or is it an opportunity? Well, the answer to that is kind of depends, right? It depends on where your footprint is. If on the left here, you can see the CBRS spectrum holdings for utilities, and there are some areas in the country where the utilities definitely banking on leveraging CBRS to drive last mile connectivity. But on the right, you can see the holdings by the wireless company. In many areas, the wireless company is going to leverage CBRS for last mile connections. So these are all factors that utilities should be looking at as they plan their business strategy for the next several years. And it somewhat depends again on what your position is and whether you participate in the auction or not, or whether somebody else participated in the footprint that you own. Okay, so now I think we're gonna take some time for Q&A. We've got a few minutes left, so we'll take some questions from the audience.